Manhattan prosecutor Jeremy Saland. Jeremy, good to see you. 9 charges here, 3 felonies, 6 misdemeanors related to tax fraud, evasion, filing false returns. As Paula Reed reported, Hunter Biden has paid the back taxes. He has paid the penalties. Are these typical charges, all of them, any of them, considering that he's made the government whole? He's paid what he owes.
You know, I think a lot of people would be surprised that even when there's a tax fraud, even when it's clear that there's been a crime, people are often allowed to pay off those monies. And when they do, and the penalties as Biden has done, then they're often not prosecuted. That doesn't mean they can't be or they shouldn't be, but they're often not. So it is a little surprising. And I think there is some credibility when the statement is, if this wasn't Biden and that wasn't his name, he wouldn't be prosecuted. But at the same time, he's been caught. The evidence seems strong. And if you look at the Central District of California, which I just happened to take a look, there are other crimes that are similar in dollar amount that haven't prosecuted for tax frauds.
Okay, so some truth to what Abby Lowell says, that if his last name were anything other than Biden, these charges would not have been filed. So I asked Errol Lewis last hour from a political context. I'll ask you from a legal context. When the chair of the House Oversight and Accountability Committee says that he is concerned that maybe these charges were filed to protect Hunter Biden from testifying. Is there any validity you see in that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think one could argue that, Weiss, the special counsel, felt pressure that he had to come up with an indictment and he had to move forward on this case. Because remember, there was already a deal in place that fell through, not necessarily the fault of Biden or Weiss, but it fell through. So I don't think that's a fair statement politically. That may be, some red meat. But from a legal perspective, I would say no.
When these go to, if they go to trial, as one imagined they would, does the, at one point, existence of a plea deal play into a potential defense?
Well, I think that is part of the defense now. Whether that's an evidentiary or factual defense, it's a legal defense. And I think that's something that Biden's team is going to confront the prosecution with, the special counsel with, and say, this should never be at this stage. We had a deal in place. I moved forward on that and I accepted that. So I think that's more of an issue now, not necessarily a testimony at trial. I think that'll be a little bit different. Okay,
let's move on to Trump, and this is specifically the federal election subversion case and the upholding largely of the gag order. Trump is now barred from attacking court staff, the prosecutor's staff, special prosecutor staff, but he can still target Jack Smith. Explain why.
Well, first of all, it was kind of like a battle between the First Amendment and Trump's right to free speech, as well as making sure that judicial process is maintained and fair. So what can happen, what can't happen, there's a carve out for Jack Smith. So that allows Donald Trump to get on his pulpit after a court appearance, wherever he may be, or just in general, to say this is a political witch hunt. He has wide latitude. It's very broad as to Jack Smith, but then it's limited. So whereas before witnesses were not fair game, witnesses now are fair game, but there's an asterisk here, but they cannot, or Trump cannot attack them in their role as witnesses in his cases. So there's the difference. It's a win for Donald Trump, but it's also a win for the judicial process. It's not a home run by any stretch, but it does give Trump some latitude. And I would say this, though, even though he has a leash there, we know that Donald Trump sometimes pushes it and pushes it. I would not be shocked if he runs afoul of this as well.
Yeah, and that's an interesting distinction because the appeals court said that Trump cannot attack the court staff, cannot attack Jack Smith's staff because of the concern that it could spur violence against these people. But he can still attack the witnesses, just not for their role in the case. Wouldn't the concern of violence be valid as it relates to those witnesses, even if it has nothing to do with the election subversion case?
Yeah, that's a fair conclusion, Victor, but at the same time, there's a First Amendment right. And as the appellate court said, there is an interest by the public to hear Donald Trump speak and share his thoughts as a presidential candidate. And for example, before, if it was Pence, we'll use that as an example, that was someone who he was running against. How could you preclude Donald Trump from saying something about an opponent in an election? It just can't impact that case, so it does not cause a problem in the fair administration of justice. So it's that tight line and a tight rope. Yeah. Again, I would not be shocked if he runs afoul at some point.
Kenneth Chesborough, CNN exclusive reporting here, is that he, of course, pleaded guilty in the Georgia, the state election subversion case there. He's cooperating in Georgia and with prosecutors in Nevada and Michigan and Wisconsin. Arizona has reached out as well. How crucial is he to these state cases?
Well, we have to learn a lot more about these fake elector cases in the other states, and some, as we understand, has been presented to the grand jury. I believe it was Nevada. Obviously, he's crucial. Obviously, he's an element. Is he the biggest fish? For example, Giuliani? Maybe not. But they would not be using him, and he would not be offering himself, his services, if he was not a very important element, because he has exposure in those cases. And why would you say, I'm going to plead and work with the prosecution in one case, only to allow myself to be vulnerable in a second, third, or fourth case? So he no doubt has information. Whether he's that fly on the wall and knows everything, or he has his hands in everything, we'll find out. But he absolutely has value, and he knows something. Otherwise, he wouldn't be cooperating or being contacted by these offices.
Yeah, has information, will travel. Jeremy Saland, thanks so much.
All right.